welcome to China's Living Legends.
欢迎来到我的频道。
So imagine, if you will, a sort of modern-day academic superstar. I mean, we are talking about somebody who is, say, a Rhodes Scholar.
Right, like the absolute top of their class.
Exactly. Top of their class at Harvard or maybe Oxford. The kind of person who has just been nominated by the President of the United States for this massive, high-ranking cabinet position.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So their future is completely limitless. They've got the ear of the most powerful people in the world, and they have this direct path to just, shaping national policy.
Basically the peak of ambition for anyone in that field.
Right. And then, right at the precipice of ultimate political power, they turn it all down.
Wait, they just walk away?
They just walk away, they pack their bags, they move back to a small, kind of forgotten Rust Belt town in the Midwest, and they decide they're going to build, soap assembly lines and textile mills from scratch.
I mean, it sounds completely unhinged when you put it in a modern context like that. You would assume they were having some sort of massive psychological break,
You would. You'd look at this person and think, what are you doing? You won the game, and now you're going to go tinker with factory machinery.
Yeah, people would think it was a prank.
But the crazy thing is, this isn't a hypothetical.
Yeah.
This exact scenario, the historical equivalent of it actually happened.
It did.
And the person who did it was a man named Zhang Jian.
Yeah, and to really grasp the magnitude of what Zhang Jian did, we need to sort of anchor ourselves in the late Qing dynasty in China. So we're talking about the late 1800s.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, he wasn't just a good student. He was literally the valedictorian of the entire empire.
Which is saying something.
Oh, absolutely. He achieved the highest possible rank in the Chinese imperial examinations.
I want to pause right there, actually, because I think we throw around terms like imperial examinations today, and it just sounds like, a really tough SAT or something.
About like a stressful finals week.
Exactly. But this was a completely different beast, wasn't it? What does it actually mean to be the valedictorian of this specific system?
Well, the imperial examination system was basically the sole engine of social mobility and political power in China. And it had been for over a millennium.
1,000 years of this same test.
Yeah. Millions of men would study their entire lives, literally memorizing thousands of pages of classical texts just to pass the local levels of this thing.
Just the local levels.
Right. And to reach the final stage, you were locked in a tiny cell for days.
Wait, literally locked in?
Literally locked in. You had a bucket and you're writing materials.
Yeah.
And you're writing these massive essays on statecraft and philosophy and poetry.
That sounds like torture.
It was incredibly grueling. And Zhang Jian didn't just pass. He took first place in the highest palace examination.
Wow.
And that test was administered by the emperor himself. He earned the title of Zhuangguan. So out of hundreds of millions of people in the empire, he was officially declared the single most brilliant mind of his generation.
So he is the ultimate academic lottery winner.
Basically, yeah. And for a traditional Confucian intellectual, there was simply no higher honor on earth. None.
So what happens after you win? Do you just get a nice plaque?
No, you are immediately thrust into the absolute highest echelons of power. He started advising on military affairs. He established these really prestigious academies. He managed massive river disasters and relief efforts. Yeah, he was the standard bearer of the elite. His whole job was practically applying ancient wisdom to govern the masses.
So he was the guy the empire called when it had a major systemic problem.
Exactly.
Which makes this so fascinating, because our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how this specific guy, at the absolute zenith of this 2,000-year-old system, decided to just throw it all away.
Yeah, it's a huge pivot.
Because today, we are unpacking how his seemingly baffling career change basically birthed China's transition into modern mercantilism.
You really did.
We are looking at the death of this ancient way of life and the really chaotic, messy birth of a new one. And it all centers around his decision to start making, of all things, soap and cotton.
It really is the perfect focal point for this era. Because when he pivoted, he didn't just, dabble in business. He went all in.
Right. He didn't just open a little boutique.
No, he built a massive empire of industry in his hometown of Jiangsu, Nantong. I mean, he opened cotton mills and then flour mills and then soap factories.
Just cascading into all these different sectors.
Exactly. Then he moved into infrastructure. So he's building power plants, docks, roads. He literally drew up a master plan to turn his hometown into a modern industrialized city.
That is insane scale. But I keep getting stuck on the social reaction to this.
Oh, the backlash.
Right. Because today, if a top politician left office to start, say, a tech company, we'd applaud them. We'd say they're being innovative, or maybe they're just cashing in, but it's definitely within the bounds of normal, acceptable ambition.
Sure, it happens all the time now.
But in the late Qing dynasty, doing this wasn't just weird. It was deeply, deeply shameful, wasn't it?
The social stigma was immense. It's actually really hard for us to intuitively grasp today.
Because our culture is so pro-business.
Exactly. But for 2 millennia, the Chinese Empire's moral foundation rested on a very specific, rigid hierarchy. The state actively prioritized agriculture, and they vehemently suppressed commerce.
Suppress it.
Yeah.
Why the intense hatred for commerce? Like, why was farming seen as noble, but selling things was seen as this massive moral failing?
So it comes down to a philosophical distinction between creation and extraction.
Okay, unpack that for me.
In the traditional Confucian mindset, a farmer takes a seed, puts it in the dirt, and creates food where there was none before.
Right.
Right. They're making something out of nothing, basically.
Exactly. They are adding tangible, life-sustaining value to the world. Now, a merchant, on the other hand, doesn't create anything.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah. They buy wheat from the farmer for one price, they move it down the river, and they sell it for a higher price. To the traditional intellectual, the merchant is basically a parasite.
A parasite. Wow.
Yeah, because they are just skimming wealth off the top of someone else's physical labor. So because they aren't swinging a hoe or operating a loom themselves, their profit is viewed as essentially stolen value.
Exactly. And therefore, the very concept of profit was seen as dirty. It was morally corrupting.
Interesting.
To blindly pursue profit was to essentially admit that you had no morals. It meant you were actively degrading the fabric of society and valuing your own luxury over the stability of the community.
Which means by the time Zhang Jian started building his factories, he was flying in the face of a 2,000-year-old moral absolute.
Completely.
How did the intellectual class, his peers, the people he had studied with and surpassed, how did they react to him suddenly building cotton mills?
Oh, they completely turned on him. The backlash was brutal.
Really? Like in public?
Yes, in public and in their writings, they literally labeled him the scum of the educated class.
Oh my God, the scum.
Yeah, they accused him of discarding all honor and shame. And you have to remember, for a man whose entire identity, his family pride, his self-worth, all of it was built on honor and righteous behavior and societal respect.
Right, that was his whole world.
So this was a catastrophic blow to his reputation.
I'm trying to put myself in his shoes, and the psychological toll must have been just unbearable.
Oh, it had to be.
It's like a beloved modern-day humanitarian, someone who has spent their life building orphanages and winning Nobel Peace Prizes, suddenly quitting, putting on a pinstripe suit, and becoming a ruthless Wall Street day trader who short sells pension funds.
That is a great analogy.
The social whiplash would be deafening. People would think you had literally lost your mind. Why would a guy who has the respect of the emperor subject himself to that kind of humiliation?
Well, to willingly become a social pariah like that, something massive has to shift in your worldview.
Right.
You don't just wake up one day, look at your prestigious government career, and decide to throw it away for a steam-powered loom, unless you believe in your bones that it is a matter of absolute survival.
Because a moral loophole doesn't just magically appear out of thin air. There has to be a catalyst. So what broke the illusion for him?
The catalyst was the year 1894. Specifically, the devastating naval defeat China suffered in the First Sino-Japanese War.
Okay, paint a picture of this for us. How bad was this defeat, and why did it hit the intellectual so hard?
It was an existential shock. To put it in perspective, this was essentially the Sputnik moment for Chinese intellectuals, but with vastly bloodier consequences.
Oh, man, I love that comparison.
Yeah.
So just like America in the late 1950s, we're cruising along, feeling totally technologically superior, and then suddenly you look up and the Soviets have a satellite beeping over your head and you realize you were desperately behind.
The dynamic is very similar, yeah. But the cultural humiliation here was arguably worse.
Why is that?
Because before 1894, there was still this prevailing sense among the Chinese elite that their civilization was culturally, morally, and structurally superior to everyone else, especially their neighbors.
Right, the Middle Kingdom mindset.
Exactly. Japan was historically viewed as a cultural younger brother, but the tragedy of this war completely shattered that worldview. The Chinese fleet was absolutely decimated by a modernized Japanese military.
Wow.
Yeah, they were equipped with state-of-the-art artillery and ironclad warships.
And suddenly, all that classical education seems incredibly fragile, doesn't it?
That was the terrifying realization. You can be the smartest person in the empire, you can recite the 4 books and the 5 classics all day long.
Wait, for those of you who aren't steeped in Chinese history, what exactly are those? Is that like their version of a Western classical education? Like reading Homer and Plato?
Very much so. The 4 books and 5 classics are the authoritative books of Confucianism. They cover poetry, history, rituals, and profound ethical philosophy.
So heavy humanities stuff.
Exactly. And mastering them was basically the sole metric of a person's worth and their capability to govern.
Okay, but then the war happens.
Right. The intellectuals are looking at the smoldering wreckage of their fleet and they suddenly realize something awful. You can write the most beautiful, structurally perfect poetry in human history, but poetry does not deflect an armor-piercing artillery shell.
Man, it's a brutal collision between ancient philosophy and modern metallurgy.
It really is. And this realization woke Zhang Jian up from that 2,000-year-old agrarian dream.
He sees the writing on the wall.
He realized that if China wanted to merely survive the encroaching colonial powers, let alone be rich and powerful, it had to build up modern industry. The traditional agrarian utopia where farmers farm and scholars study was just dead.
Okay, so he sees the existential threat. He knows the solution is industrialization. But he still has a massive personal problem here.
His reputation.
Yes, he still has to face his peers who think he's evil for pursuing profit. How does he justify it to them, or even to himself? Like, how does a Confucian scholar rationalize becoming a CEO?
What's fascinating is how he manages to thread the needle philosophically here. He essentially discovers, or rather engineers, a Confucian loophole.
A philosophical loophole to justify heavy industry. I love this. How did he structure the argument?
So Zhang Jian argued that he wasn't opening factories to get rich personally. He wasn't doing it to buy fancy houses, acquire vast estates, or indulge in luxury.
Okay.
He said he was doing it to build national wealth and power. Now, traditional Confucianism absolutely valued righteousness over profit. That was non-negotiable.
Right, the merchant is a parasite.
Exactly. However, it also dictated a very clear hierarchy of interests. Private interests could never, ever eclipse public interests.
The collective good is always higher than individual desire.
Correct. So Zhang Jian poses this question. What is the ultimate public interest right now?
Survival.
Exactly. It isn't maintaining a pristine agrarian hierarchy. It's building a rich, powerful nation that can defend itself against foreign ironclads and preserve the culture itself.
Okay, I see the flip happening.
Therefore, if you are pursuing profit for the sake of the nation's strength, you are not valuing profit over righteousness, you are actually performing the ultimate act of righteousness.
Wow.
In his framework, profit for the nation is righteousness.
That is brilliant judo right there. He takes the very moral framework that is condemning him, this Confucian collective duty, and he flips it to justify building commercial factories.
Masterful.
He essentially tells his critics, look, I'm not a greedy merchant. I'm a patriot. This cotton mill is my battlefield.
And the thing is, this wasn't just a clever PR spin to make himself feel better. It was a vital, necessary transformation for the entire culture.
It gave them a way out.
Yes. By achieving this conceptual self-consistency, intellectuals like Zhang Jian provided the philosophical cover that gave the rest of the country permission to slowly accept the principle of profit.
Because someone at the top did it first?
Exactly. And once this mindset shifted, the very definition of the state began to change.
How so?
Well, the state was no longer just a moral guardian meant to keep people virtuous. It was redefined as a tool to actively promote economic growth.
Because if the state doesn't promote economic growth, the state gets conquered by people with better boats and bigger guns.
Precisely. If the political and legal systems didn't benefit national wealth and power, they had to be torn down and rebuilt. This legitimization of profit is basically the first massive step toward modernity for them.
Because in a modern state, economic growth is the whole point.
Right. The pursuit of profit is recognized as the engine of individual action, and economic growth becomes the primary goal of government policy.
It's wild to think about a time when economic growth wasn't the main goal of a government.
Yeah.
Today, if a politician doesn't talk about GDP or job creation or inflation. They don't get elected. It's the absolute baseline expectation of what a state is supposed to do for you.
Oh, for sure. But if we zoom out and connect this to the bigger picture, it's really important to realize this resistance to profit wasn't just a Chinese phenomenon.
It wasn't.
No, the moral suspicion of profit-seeking is deeply embedded in human history all across the globe.
Really. The West had this same hang-up, because we tend to think of the West as the historical birthplace of relentless capitalism.
We do now, yeah. But that's a relatively recent development. During the Western Middle Ages, the pursuit of profit and money was also viewed as a profound moral degradation.
So they hated merchants too.
Absolutely. Up until the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, profit-seeking carried a heavy burden of moral guilt. The church strictly condemned usury, which is charging interest on loans.
Right.
Merchants were often viewed with intense suspicion. They were seen as greedy middlemen taking advantage of honest laborers.
That sounds exactly like the Confucian critique.
It's remarkably similar. It wasn't until the 17th and 18th centuries that Western thinkers began to perform their own philosophical gymnastics to justify capitalism.
Okay, so how did the West justify it? Did they find a similar loophole to Zhang Jian's nationalism?
They found a loophole, but it took a very different flavor. Western thinkers began to argue that while pursuing profit might not be inherently good or noble, it could predictably lead to positive social consequences.
Okay, give me an example.
Take the British philosopher David Hume, for example.
What was his argument?
Well, Hume proposed a highly pragmatic idea. He argued that human beings are naturally flawed and driven by base desires. You can't change that.
Very cynical, but okay.
Right. But, he said, you could use one evil to suppress another.
Wait, using evil against evil.
Yes. Specifically, you could encourage the evil of loving wealth, the desire to acquire money and property, to suppress the much worse, more destructive desires for idle pleasure or reckless debauchery or violent military conquest.
Oh, that's deeply cynical, but incredibly practical.
Isn't it?
He's basically saying, look, people are going to be greedy and ambitious anyway. Let's at least point that greed toward building businesses and trading goods instead of starting wars or just lying around doing nothing.
Exactly. It harnesses human nature rather than trying to suppress it through religious guilt. And Hume had a very good friend who took this idea even further, systematizing it into the foundation of modern economics.
A friend of his.
A name you are definitely familiar with, Adam Smith.
Ah, the father of modern capitalism, the creator of the invisible hand.
That's the one. Adam Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand basically told people that if you just allow everyone to pursue their own selfish individual interests, the market mechanism miraculously brings about general social benefit.
Right.
To paraphrase his famous example, the baker doesn't bake bread because he loves you, or because he wants to fulfill a public duty. He bakes bread because he wants your money.
But the result is good.
Right. As a result of his selfishness, you get to eat, and society thrives.
Hold on. I want to push back on that comparison for a second, though.
Okay, go ahead.
Because I see where you're going with the intellectual gymnastics. But Adam Smith and Zhang Jian seem to be operating on fundamentally different mechanisms here.
How so?
Well, Smith is saying, let people be selfish, and the invisible hand magically helps the collective. It's highly individualistic, right?
Yes.
But Zhang Jian is saying, I am not being selfish at all. I am explicitly weaponizing commerce for the survival of the state. One relies on individual greed as an invisible engine, and the other relies on fierce, conscious nationalism. Are they really achieving the same thing?
That is a brilliant distinction, and you've really hit on the core divergence between Western capitalism and Chinese state-led mercantilism that actually still exists today.
Oh, interesting.
You are absolutely right. The mechanisms of justification are wildly different. Smith sanitizes greed. Zhang Jian grafts it into military service.
Right. That's a good way to put it.
But the outcome in both cultures was identical. They both successfully decoupled the act of making money from moral failure.
They made it okay to get rich.
Exactly. Both societies found a way to make profit-seeking socially acceptable, which ultimately allowed them to redefine the state's main goal as economic growth. They were both necessary, culturally specific gateways into the modern industrialized world.
Okay, so the philosophical mindset problem is solved. Zhang Jian has convinced himself, and he's starting to convince his peers, that building a factory is this righteous, patriotic duty.
The intellectual hurdle is cleared.
But let's get down to the gritty reality of this. Because changing your mindset is one thing. Actually building a heavy industrial cotton mill from scratch when your entire background is writing poetry and studying philosophy.
Yeah, that's a whole different ballgame.
That is a colossal operational nightmare. How did he practically pull this off? Like, how does a disgraced scholar acquire land, train peasant farmers to work on a clock, and get his hands on modern machinery in the late 1800s?
That brings us to the operational reality. And you're spot on, the friction was immense. Taking that first step into the physical world of industry is always the hardest. And Zhang Jian couldn't do it alone.
He didn't have the skills.
Right. He didn't have the capital. And as a scholar, he didn't have the commercial supply chain knowledge. The catalyst for the actual physical factories was a man named Zhang Jian.
Now, I was looking at the notes on this era, and the irony here is that Zhang Jian couldn't have built his private empire without the exact institution he just walked away from, the government.
Yep.
Tell me about Zhang Jian.
So Zhang Jian was a highly prominent, deeply powerful minister during the late Qing dynasty, and he was a leading figure in what was known as the self-strengthening movement.
Self-strengthening movement.
Right. He was essentially the government official who looked at Zhang Jian and said, I need you to open a cotton mill in Nantong, and I will back you.
So it wasn't just a lone wolf entrepreneurial venture like we might imagine today in a garage. It was a state-directed initiative.
Oh, it was a highly structured partnership. And Minister Zhang provided much more than just a suggestion or his political blessing. He provided the physical, material foundation.
What did he actually give him?
Well, the minister had previously used state funds to purchase a massive amount of modern steam-powered textile machinery from overseas.
Right.
He bought it under the official government name, because at that time, only the state had the leverage, the foreign contacts, and the sheer capital to import heavy industrial equipment.
Right. A local scholar couldn't just order a steam engine out of a catalog.
Exactly. So Minister Zhang takes this state-owned machinery and turns it over to Zhang Jian.
Just gives it to him.
Well, they evaluate the cost of that machinery and they convert it into official government shares, which made up 50% of the total equity of the new enterprise.
Let me make sure I have this straight. The government provides the capital equipment, takes a 50% equity stake in the company, and lets the private citizen figure out the day-to-day operations, the labor, and the local logistics.
Yes. They engineered a public-private partnership, a PPP.
That is incredibly modern. That's exactly how we build massive infrastructure projects today, like toll roads or power grids or stadiums.
It was revolutionary for China at the time. And for Zhang Jian, this arrangement was an absolute lifesaver because it gave his startup factory the two things he desperately lacked: legal status and commercial credibility.
The credibility piece is huge.
Imagine you are a disgraced scholar trying to raise operating capital from local merchants. They don't trust you. They think you're an arrogant poet playing with machines.
Right. Why would they give you money?
But it changes the entire conversation when you can walk into a room and say, by the way, the imperial government of China is my 50% equity partner.
That completely de-risks the venture for external investors.
Exactly.
Because if the government is backing it, local officials aren't going to shut it down over a zoning dispute or a fake tax charge. It's the ultimate seal of approval.
And if we look at historical parallels again, this specific business model has a very famous, incredibly powerful precedent in the West.
Oh, really? What's the precedent?
Think about Europe during the Age of Discovery. How did European nations fund those incredibly risky, massively expensive voyages to the other side of the world to secure trade routes?
Oh, you're talking about the royal charters, like the East India Company.
Exactly. Monarchs would issue royal charters to establish entities like the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company.
Right, they had royal backing.
It's the classic incubator model. The government provides the political umbrella, the military backing, and the initial capital or monopoly rights. But the state knows it is terrible at actually running a business.
Governments aren't great at logistics.
Right. So the private entrepreneur handles the efficient commercial operation, the haggling, the trading, and the day-to-day logistics. The collaboration between Minister Zhang and scholar Zhang Jian was the late Qing government's boldest attempt at this exact kind of modern commercial operation.
I just love the idea of the government acting as a venture capital firm.
That's pretty much what they were doing.
Because essentially, out of sheer survival instinct after that naval defeat, the imperial government realizes they can't just rely on taxing peasant farmers to buy warships anymore. They literally have to incubate industrial startups to generate the wealth needed to survive the modern era.
Yep.
The government takes the heavy capital risk, and Zhang Jian provides the sweat equity and the local networking.
That is the perfect way to look at it. The state became an incubator. And this leads us to the massive macro shift that was happening in the background, which we touched on earlier, the self-strengthening movement.
The slogan for that movement was self-strengthening and seeking wealth.
Right.
Right, which perfectly aligns with the philosophical loophole we discussed.
Yes, and it fundamentally rewired national policy.
How so?
Well, before this movement, the state viewed merchants with deep suspicion, constantly taxing them arbitrarily and keeping them at the bottom of the social ladder.
Or parasites.
Right. But through the self-strengthening movement, the government explicitly validated the status of merchants and industrialists at the state level for the first time in 2,000 years.
Wow.
They finally admitted a hard truth. Private enterprise, driven by the profit motive, was vastly more efficient than state-run bureaucracies.
So how did they actually support this new class of industrialists?
Yeah.
Beyond just handing over a few textile machines to one guy, how did the state institutionalize this pivot?
They went all out, restructuring the government itself. They established commerce bureaus in various provinces to actively promote trade.
Okay.
They created a dedicated Ministry of Commerce at the central government level.
A Ministry of Commerce.
Mm-hmm.
That is a massive signal to the market. That is institutionalizing the pivot right there.
It goes even deeper than that. They introduced modern commercial laws to maintain market rules. They strengthened property rights protection.
Which is absolutely essential. I mean, nobody is going to invest 10 years of their life building a sprawling factory complex if a local magistrate can just seize it on a whim.
Exactly. Without property rights, you have no long-term capital investment. It just doesn't happen.
Did they do anything else?
Yeah. They also proactively opened new treaty ports to facilitate international trade. They provided government-backed loans for private enterprises to scale up. They even started handing out aristocratic titles and official state honors to successful industrialists.
Wait, really?
Yes.
So they took the very profession that used to be a complete social disgrace, being a merchant, the so-called parasites of society, and they started slapping aristocratic titles on them.
Wild, isn't it?
Talk about a 180-degree turn.
Yeah.
The overarching environment completely flipped to favor the entrepreneur.
And this robust government backing is precisely what allowed Zhang Jian's initial cotton mill to absolutely explode in scale.
So it worked.
Oh, it worked incredibly well. His factories multiplied. He expanded into those flour mills, the shipping lines, the power plants we talked about. His operations grew immensely complex.
And highly profitable, I assume.
Very. And eventually he became so successful, so well capitalized, and so operationally dominant that he no longer needed the state's umbrella.
He didn't need the incubator anymore.
Right. He slowly shed the government partnership altogether. He bought out the state's equity and took his empire fully private.
He essentially took the company public, or at least fully independent.
He did. And his personal success, which was mirrored by the success of other industrialists emerging across the country, led to a massive social upheaval.
Because everyone saw what was possible.
Exactly. Which brings us to the total deepening of China's economic and social transition. The entire country was beginning the painful, chaotic process of moving away from traditional agriculture and handicraft, weaving toward large-scale mechanized machine production.
It's the Industrial Revolution, basically, but highly compressed and accelerated because they are importing the technology and the economic models all at once.
Right. It was a period of intense intellectual ferment. There was a famous thinker at the time, Kang Youwei, who explicitly put forward the slogan, "Establish an industrial nation."
Establish an industrial nation.
Yeah. The ideological recognition was spreading rapidly among the elite. But, ideas are cheap. You needed first-hand practitioners, pioneers like Zhang Jian to put skin in the game and actually prove the model could work in reality.
And he definitely proved it. But I want to explore what this monumental success did to him personally and to his social standing.
It changed everything.
Because we started this story with him being labeled the scum of the educated class, right? Enduring endless eye rolls, public humiliation, the total loss of his esteemed reputation.
Yeah, he was a total outcast.
So what happens to the social dynamic when the pariah suddenly becomes the richest, most vital man in the province?
Well, as we see throughout history, massive financial success and infrastructural power tend to change people's moral opinions very quickly.
Funny how that works. The scum of the earth suddenly becomes a visionary when he's employing half the town and generating massive tax revenue.
Exactly. Once his factory succeeded and his master plan for Nantong began to materialize, he became a deeply revered figure again.
Redemption.
But on a whole new level, he wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He became a legitimate, undeniable power broker. Because of his vast resources, his network, and his newly minted respectability, he stepped far beyond the realm of commerce.
What did he do?
He became a leading voice in the political movement to establish a constitution for China.
Really?
Yes. And later, during periods of intense civil strife, he acted as a crucial behind-the-scenes negotiator, brokering peace between the North and South of China.
That is massive political power.
It is. And eventually, he became the chief planner for industrial construction in the newly formed Republic of China.
Those are staggering achievements.
Yeah.
He went from a disgraced startup founder to a foundational national statesman.
To give you a clear American parallel, think about the titans of the American Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century,
Okay.
which was happening right around the same time.
You mean the robber barons or the captains of industry, depending on how you view them? Guys like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan.
Exactly them. Those men weren't just running steel mills and oil refineries. They were economic titans who could single-handedly sway national politics.
Right, they were practically a shadow government.
They influenced federal policy, built infrastructure, and wielded power that rivaled the government itself. I mean, at one point, J.P. Morgan essentially bailed out the entire United States Treasury.
True.
Zhang Jian achieved that level of systemic influence in China. His success marked the definitive moment when China's newly formed industrialist class stepped onto the national political stage, wielding the same, if not more, weight as the old imperial scholars.
Which means the entire social pyramid we talked about earlier just got completely turned upside down.
It was a total structural social inversion.
We talked about the traditional four-tiered social structure of the empire that had held for 2,000 years, right?
Right. Scholars at the absolute top, then the farmers who created the food, then the artisans who made the tools, and finally the merchants at the very bottom, scraping profit off the work of others.
That entire structure collapsed.
It really did. The concept of equality between scholars and merchants, the idea that commerce was just as vital as study, finally took firm hold in the culture.
Because he proved it.
Yes. Zhang Jian wasn't just a historical person anymore. He became a living symbol. He proved that you could be both a brilliant scholar and a ruthless, effective merchant, and that neither pursuit was inherently morally superior to the other.
It's a complete paradigm shift. The people who were historically viewed as societal parasites were now recognized as the indispensable engines of national survival.
Without them, the nation falls.
But as we look at the arc of his life, there's a beautiful, almost poetic irony to where he ends up, isn't there?
The irony is arguably the best part of his entire story.
Lay it out for us.
So think back to how he started. His very first factory, the one that launched his empire, was a public-private partnership.
Right?
He absolutely relied on government-purchased machinery, government equity, and the political protection of Minister Zhang to get off the ground.
He needed the State-Incubator to survive the incredibly fragile startup phase. He wouldn't have made it without government intervention.
Exactly. Well, jump forward a few decades. The Qing dynasty has fallen. Zhang Jian is now serving as the Minister of Industry and Commerce for the newly established Republic of China.
Okay.
And in this incredibly powerful government role, overseeing the nation's economic policy, what do you think he advocates for?
I don't know. More state support.
No. He starts loudly and aggressively arguing that state-run enterprises are massive, inefficient money wasters.
You're kidding.
No. He says they are bloated bureaucracies run by people who don't understand business, and he formally demands that they be shut down and fully privatized.
That is incredible. It has to be the most spectacular full-circle journey I've ever heard.
It's pretty amazing.
He starts his career as a government-backed, heavily subsidized startup founder who literally needs state equity to survive. And he ends his career as a hardcore free market evangelist, calling for the government to get completely out of the way of private business.
It is a profound evolution.
Why did he flip so hard?
He realized through his own gritty experience that while the government is uniquely positioned to provide an initial umbrella of capital and legal protection, they are fundamentally terrible at actually running commercial operations efficiently.
Because they aren't motivated by the same pressures.
Right. His own private enterprises, once he shed the government's 50% stake and took total control, were vastly more successful, agile, and profitable than any of the state-run factories. So he took that hard-won lesson straight to the top of the new government.
He essentially became the ultimate capitalist. It's just wild. From reciting ancient Confucian poetry in a locked exam cell to demanding the mass privatization of state assets on the national stage.
And that profound personal evolution is exactly why his story is so crucial to understanding the era.
It encapsulates everything.
When you look at Zhang Jian and the massive factory complexes he built, they aren't just brick, mortar, and steam engines. They physically embody the agonizing transformation of an entire civilization's mindset. They highlight the monumental importance of the government's initial push to jumpstart an industry, and they reveal the deep structural inversion of China's society.
He really is a vital symbol, a human bridge between two completely different worlds.
He is. If you want to visualize it, his factories are like a giant silhouette cast on the wall of history, standing right at the exact moment China pivoted.
I love that image.
If you look behind that silhouette, you see the death of a 2,000-year agrarian tradition. The old world of elite scholars looking down their noses at merchants is just gone, shattered by modern artillery.
And ahead of it.
If you look ahead of that silhouette, you see the chaotic, powerful, unstoppable birth of modern mercantilism. You see the rough foundation of the economic powerhouse that would eventually follow in the decades and centuries to come. His inclusion in the pantheon of global financial history isn't just justified, it's absolute.
It really makes you take a step back and realize how incredibly fragile our so-called permanent societal rules actually are.
Oh, completely.
I mean, we are talking about a moral framework regarding money, profit, and social class that was deeply entrenched, studied, and enforced for over 2,000 years.
It was the bedrock of their reality.
And yet, due to a sudden technological and military shock, that devastating naval defeat, that entire 2-millennia-old belief system was completely dismantled, rationalized away, and flipped upside down in a single generation.
It evaporated almost overnight, the moment it collided with hard, undeniable reality. Ideology rarely survives a direct hit from an ironclad warship.
Which leaves us with a lingering, slightly uncomfortable question for you to ponder today as you go about your life.
Yeah.
If a massive civilization can abandon a 2,000-year-old moral absolute back just because the circumstances of technological survival change what deeply held, completely unquestioned societal beliefs about work, value, and morality are we holding on to right now?
It's a great question.
What are the things we consider to be absolute truths about our economy today that might completely vanish tomorrow when the next massive technological shock arrives?
We always assume our current economic morality is the final, perfected version. But history, especially the life of Zhang Jian, tells us it rarely is.
Maybe in 100 years, people will look back at us the exact same way we look at those scholars who thought building a cotton mill was an act of evil.
It's highly likely.
It really makes you wonder what our own modern blind spots are and what we might be forced to abandon. Some heavy food for thought as we wrap up this deep dive. What if the only way to save your country from being, completely conquered was to actually let your own citizens drastically cut your salary?
That is quite the scenario.
Right. But in 1911, the absolute rulers of the largest empire on Earth tried to do exactly that.
Yeah, it's wild.
I mean, imagine for a second that you are in charge of this massive ancient empire. We're talking centuries of rich history, immense territory, just hundreds of millions of people. But right now, you are on the absolute brink of collapse.
The walls are closing in.
Exactly. Foreign powers are carving up your borders. Existential threats are literally everywhere. And you need miracle.
Yeah.
Well, it usually says you need to build a bigger army.
Right. You think, let's fortify the borders, manufacture more weapons, draft more soldiers.
But the reality of history tells us the answer isn't military at all. To actually save a failing empire, you have to completely change how that empire makes and manages its money.
Yeah, you have to rebuild the engine.
So, for this deep dive, our mission today is to explore this deeply dramatic, pivotal moment when the late Qing dynasty desperately tried to avoid extinction.
And it is a fascinating story.
It really is. To pull this off, they attempted this gravity-defying leap, trying to jump straight from an ancient, self-sufficient agrarian mindset
Right, very traditional.
into the cutthroat, hyper-complex world of modern global capitalist finance.
Which really highlights the ultimate truth of statecraft. I mean, what a state taxes and how it taxes ultimately dictates what that state becomes.
Totally.
Historically, the Qing dynasty, they taxed land and populations. It was this very straightforward agricultural model.
I keep it simple. Right.
But survival in the modern world meant they had to tax industry, commerce, international trade. And, you simply cannot regulate a 20th century global economy with a bureaucracy built for medieval farming.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
You'd need new institutions, entirely new types of officials, and a completely rewritten rule book.
Exactly.
And the architect of this incredible transformation in China is someone who completely defies expectations. His name is Zaize.
Oh, Zaize. He's a walking contradiction in the best possible way.
Oh, so?
Well, he wasn't some outside revolutionary, or a grassroots progressive reformer pushing against the system. He was the ultimate royal insider.
Really? Like inner circle?
Oh, absolutely. He was a prominent member of the imperial family. He was a nephew-in-law to the incredibly powerful Empress Dowager Cixi.
Wow.
Yeah, and his wife's biological sister was the Empress of the Guangxu Emperor. I mean, Zaize was as entrenched in the archaic, absolute power structure of the old system as a person could possibly be.
Yet he's the guy. He becomes the man who tries to violently drag Chinese finance into the 20th century.
He is the guy.
That's crazy. I mean, to modernize an ancient state, you first need a blueprint, right?
Yeah.
But if you are an insular empire that has believed for centuries that you are the literal center of the universe, the heavenly kingdom, where do you even find that blueprint?
You have to look outward.
You're forced to look outward. But a state usually only drops its pride and does that when it experiences a profound, undeniable shock.
Right. And for the Qing dynasty, that geopolitical shockwave arrived in 1905 with the Russo-Japanese War.
Oh, man. It is hard to overstate what a terrifying global wake-up call this was for the Qing court.
It was earth-shattering for them.
You had this massive, traditional autocratic monarchy in Russia going to war with a much smaller but newly modernized constitutional monarchy in Japan.
And Japan won decisively.
Right, decisively. And watching this happen right next door, I mean, that had to send a very clear, chilling message to the Qing rulers.
It absolutely did. The message was that autocratic empires are completely obsolete. Constitutional systems are the future. Adapt immediately or die.
So in response, the Qing court does something that is honestly hard to fathom, given their history of isolation and supremacy.
Yeah, they organized the 5 Ministers Overseas Mission.
Yes. They send this high-level delegation to literally travel the globe and study foreign political and economic systems. And the person leading this charge is Zaize.
And to really grasp the magnitude of this, you have to understand the sheer ego check involved here.
Oh, I was thinking about this. It's like if Queen Victoria, right at the absolute height of the British Empire, sent her most trusted, high-ranking royal prince to go sit in foreign capitals and take notes like a college freshman.
Yeah, or perhaps a better historical comparison is Peter the Great's famous Grand Embassy, where the Russian Tsar went incognito to learn shipbuilding in Western Europe.
Yes, exactly like that. You have a core royal member of this massive Eastern Empire completely dropping the arrogant pretense that they already know everything.
Right. I mean, Zaize is personally traveling to London, Paris, Washington, Belgium, and Japan to literally just be a student.
Just a guy with a notebook.
Yeah. He is walking into foreign government buildings asking, hey, how do you build a modern constitutional government?
The psychological vulnerability of that act alone is staggering.
Yeah. It really is. And he spent this time meticulously observing, analyzing how these nations operated their treasuries, their laws, their parliaments.
And when he returns to China, he doesn't just, offer some polite diplomatic summary. He submits a secret memorial directly to Empress Dowager Cixi and the Guangxu Emperor.
Which is a massive deal.
Right. Let's clarify what a memorial is in this context.
Yeah.
Because to a modern ear, that sounds like a statue or a funeral service.
Yeah, not quite.
In the imperial Chinese court, a memorial was a highly formalized, direct, and often highly confidential letter to the throne. It was the absolute highest level of state communication.
And in this memorial, Zaize lays everything on the line. He tells the absolute rulers of his empire that they must implement a preparatory constitutional system.
Wow.
Yeah, he outlines the need for a total institutional reorganization, sweeping legal revisions, and he explicitly states they need to start drafting a constitution.
So this royal insider essentially became a radical progressive because he saw firsthand exactly what the rest of the world was doing.
Pretty much, yeah.
And one of the most critical outcomes of this push, the thing that actually starts to change the DNA of the empire, is the creation of the Duzhibu, the modern Ministry of Finance.
Right, because having decided to modernize, Zaize now had to build the bureaucratic engine to actually execute it.
He needs the machinery.
Exactly. And his first step was essentially taking a sledgehammer to the empire's oldest financial institution, the Hubu, or the Ministry of Revenue.
The Hubu was an absolute relic, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. It dated all the way back to the Tang dynasty, centuries earlier.
Yeah.
And it was designed for a very specific, static world. It managed population registration, and it managed agricultural land taxes. That is it.
So it was just the financial brain of a self-sufficient agricultural manor.
Precisely. Trying to run a modern economy with it would be like, well, trying to run a modern multinational tech corporation using only the inventory software for a local grocery store.
It just doesn't compute.
It doesn't. The country was rapidly getting swept up in global capitalist trade. Suddenly, the government have customs duties to worry about. They're issuing sovereign national bonds. They're dealing with complex international currencies and exchange rates.
You cannot run that through a medieval population registry.
You really can't. So in 1906, this massive shift happens. The Hubu is transformed into the Duzhibu, the Ministry of Finance.
And while that might sound like a simple bureaucratic rebranding, changing the name was a massive public declaration, wasn't it?
It was huge.
It was the empire officially announcing to the world and to itself that it was leapfrogging from an agrarian mindset to a modern macroeconomic powerhouse.
But as we know, a name change is always the easiest part of any reform.
Right. Now you actually have to do the work.
Exactly. A couple of years after his overseas trip, Zaize is appointed as the president of this new Ministry of Finance. He's often referred to as the Qing dynasty's last great housekeeper.
I love their title.
Yeah, but the house he inherited was an absolute nightmare of inefficiency.
Let's break down how chaotic this old system actually was. Because the old Ministry of Revenue was divided into bureaus based on the 14 provinces of the empire.
Right.
So if you were a bureau official, you managed a dozen entirely different types of businesses and taxes just for your one specific province.
And this structural flaw meant that if the central state wanted to understand, say, a specific type of commercial tax on a national level,
They physically couldn't.
That specific tax was being managed completely differently by 14 isolated, siloed bureaus.
So there was zero standardization.
Zero.
That is just the structural nightmare. The personnel situation is where it gets truly wild.
Yeah. The dual leadership.
The old ministry operated under a dual leadership system. They had two presidents, one Manchu and one Han Chinese. And they had four vice presidents, again, perfectly split between Manchu and Han.
We should probably provide some crucial context here for that. The Qing dynasty was established by the Manchu people who conquered China in 1644. So you have a Manchu ruling class governing a massive Han Chinese majority. This dual leadership system was an intentional design by the imperial system to balance power and ease ethnic tensions.
It was essentially an institutionalized paranoia mechanism.
That's a great way to put it.
Every desk had two people watching each other. In practice, it meant that Manchu and Han officials stood side by side with exactly equal authority.
Which is a disaster for decision-making.
Yeah, if you were a lower-level clerk and an issue comes across your desk, whose orders do you even follow? When everyone is a boss, no one is the boss.
And connecting this to the bigger picture of imperial authority makes the gridlock even more apparent. These presidents and vice presidents weren't even bound by a strict chain of command with each other.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Any single one of them could bypass the others and submit a memorial directly to the emperor to complain or push their own agenda.
Total bureaucratic paralysis.
Complete gridlock.
I have to ask, though, how does a single guy, even a royal insider like Zaize, just casually abolish a centuries-old ethnic power-sharing system without getting assassinated or exiled?
Well, he managed to do it by leveraging the sheer existential terror of that 1905 defeat.
Fear is a great motivator.
The best. The imperial court was so terrified of becoming completely obsolete and being conquered that they temporarily granted Zaize unprecedented authority to just break the old rules.
Wow.
So he scrapped the 14 province-based bureaus entirely.
Just wiped them out.
Gone. Instead, he reorganized the entire ministry into 10 function-based bureaus. So you suddenly have one bureau for land taxes, a separate one exclusively for commercial taxes, one for military pay, one for accounting.
It finally introduced actual logical division of labor. Institutions could suddenly collaborate on a national scale.
Right. And he also completely abolished that dual Manchu-Han leadership rule, establishing a clear top-down hierarchy, one president with clear vice presidents underneath him.
Which dramatically improved administrative efficiency.
Oh, immensely. And Zaize also recognized that traditional Confucian scholars couldn't run a modern economy.
Obviously not.
In the past, if the empire needed a new currency design, they would just grab some local artisans.
Just some guys.
Yeah, literally. Zaize put an end to that. He aggressively began hiring Western-educated, highly specialized technical staff to design and mint currency. He created a real pathway for genuine technical competence at the central level.
Okay, wait, I have a question here.
Right.
If Zaize is doing all of this to create this streamlined, all-powerful Ministry of Finance to control all the empire's money,
Right.
why did he also have to personally hold the separate titles of Superintendent of Customs and Superintendent of Salt Affairs? Like, why not just fold those highly lucrative departments directly into his brand new ministry?
Well, that points directly to the limits of his political capital.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he actually tried to merge those two massive revenue streams into the Ministry of Finance, but he hit an absolute brick wall. Well, the customs taxes were largely controlled by powerful foreign nations who had forced treaties on China. And the incredibly lucrative salt monopoly was fiercely guarded by entrenched, wealthy provincial governors who did not want Beijing taking their cash cow.
Got it. So it was a massive turf war.
A massive turf war. When he tried to officially absorb them, the resistance threatened to derail the entire reform movement.
Wow.
So holding those titles concurrently alongside his role as president of the ministry, it was a highly strategic compromise.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it allowed him to personally keep his hands on those massive revenue streams while keeping the peace, leaving the door open for the ministry to officially reclaim them later.
That's pretty clever. And even with those political compromises, the results were undeniable. You have Yuan Shikai, who was a massive political rival to Zaize, and who eventually becomes the powerful president of the Republic of China.
Yeah, major figure.
Even he had to publicly admit it. Yuan Shikai essentially stated that during this entire late Qing reform period, the Ministry of Finance was the only department that achieved real, tangible results. Everything else in the government was just putting on a show to appease the public.
That is extremely high praise from a fierce rival.
Very high praise.
But, you know, to truly earn that praise, Zaize had to do something exponentially more difficult than just restructuring an office in the capital.
What's that?
He had to figure out how much money the empire actually had.
Oh, right. Because if he just reorganized the office, how did he actually know who to tax? Did the empire even have a national ledger?
They did not.
How do you manage an empire's checkbook when you don't even know what's in the bank?
You really can't. Which leads to Zaize initiating this incredible, unprecedented national audit.
A national audit in 1910.
Yeah, he sets up a temporary direct reporting agency called the Financial Audit Bureau. And he doesn't just sit in Beijing and send polite letters. He forces every single province to set up a local audit office, and he physically dispatches supervisors straight from the ministry to travel across the empire to oversee them.
Let's just think about the logistics of that for a second. Doing a national audit today requires supercomputers, secure internet networks, and thousands of accounts.
Oh yeah, it's a massive undertaking now.
And Zaize is doing this in a massive, mostly unmodernized empire. He is sending supervisors on trains and on horseback to force local magistrates who have been cooking their books and skimming off the top for decades to open their centuries-old paper ledgers.
The friction and pushback must have been absolutely immense.
He essentially told the entire ruling class, hey, we are opening everyone's books.
He had to. He viewed financial auditing as the absolute foundational step toward any kind of constitutional system.
Makes sense.
A modern financial system relies on three incredibly rational goals. First, you have to clearly define what the government actually does. You cannot possibly calculate your costs if you don't define your functions.
Right, you have to know what you are paying for before you can pay for it.
Exactly. Second, you have to thoroughly and accurately survey the socioeconomic reality on the ground. Like, where is the taxable wealth actually located? Who currently holds it?
Yeah.
And third, only after you have that hard data can you rationally decide how to tax and where to spend.
So this audit wasn't just accountants counting copper coins. It was a massive, forceful effort to make the entire nation's resources transparent and calculable for the first time in thousands of years of history.
It was monumental, and the end result was this massive, exhaustive 20-volume compilation called the Financial Explanatory Books. It contained unprecedented data on the wealth and expenses of every single province.
And armed with that data, they finally had the one tool that every modern state relies upon, the ability to draft a real, comprehensive national budget. 1910 rolls around, And the ministry demands that all the provinces draft local budgets based on this new reality. The ministry takes all of those local drafts, aggregates them, and creates the very first national budget for the year 1911.
A huge milestone.
But here's the most shocking part. They don't just hand this budget to the emperor for a rubber stamp approval. They submit it to the Zaize, which is the newly formed National Assembly.
Think about that. A representative legislative body actively reviewing the national finances of an absolute monarchy.
It's unbelievable. And this assembly looks at the budget, argues that the central government is spending way too much money, and fiercely demands cuts.
And they actually succeed.
They do. They force the government to cut over 70 million taels of silver from the budget. Let's contextualize that number, because a tael isn't a coin, it's a traditional Chinese measurement of silver bullion.
Right, it's weight.
70 million taels represented an enormous percentage, roughly a quarter to a third of their total projected national expenditure at the time.
It was a monumental shift in power.
You see this happen, and you can't help but compare it to similar turning points in Western history. It totally mirrors the early bloody struggles over the power of the purse between the British Parliament and the King.
Absolutely.
Or how the modern U.S. Congress uses the budget to check the power of the executive branch.
Yeah.
You have this ancient Eastern Empire, literally built on absolute, unquestioned, divine authority, suddenly allowing a legislative body of representatives to drastically slash the government's own spending.
And the historical significance of that process is enormous. It was a genuine, highly functional attempt to operate a modern system of checks and balances within China. You know, a legislative body successfully holding an executive body accountable.
Which brings us to the ultimate question, doesn't
And
it?
I think I know where you're going with this.
If the ministry was this successful, if the audit was completed against all odds, and they established this groundbreaking democratic budget process, why does the empire collapse anyway?
Yeah, that's the tragedy of it.
The very next year, in 1912, the Puyi emperor abdicates. If Zaize's reforms were so effective, why did the whole thing fall apart?
It really comes down to the fundamental paradox of the imperial system itself. It is a fatal disease that no amount of clever financial restructuring could ever cure.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in an absolute empire, the monarch's power is not a public trust. It is a private privilege based on a very literal foundational concept. The emperor personally owns all the land under heaven.
Right. It is all his personal private property.
Exactly. And a system built entirely on private ownership by one single family can never truly transform into a modern system of shared public authority. It just creates endless, irreconcilable contradictions.
Because you can't have a public budget for private property.
You can't. Any tax the emperor collects is essentially just him charging rent on land he already owns.
Yeah.
Zaize was desperately trying to build a modern public financial apparatus on top of a socioeconomic foundation that was fundamentally incompatible with it.
Man, it is like trying to install a modern open-source operating system onto a computer where the hardware is permanently hardwired to only obey the commands of one specific user.
That is a perfect analogy.
The software might be brilliant, but the machine is going to crash the second you try to run it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Changing the state machinery at the very top is ultimately useless if the foundation beneath it doesn't transform as well. For the Qing dynasty, the reforms simply came too late.
History had run out of patience.
History had run out of patience. The imperial system had to be completely overthrown so a new state apparatus could be built on a truly modern foundation.
But the crucial takeaway here, I think, is that Zaize's incredible work didn't just vanish into the ether when the empire fell.
Oh no, his work was absolutely not in vain. The 1911 budget, the aborted 1912 budget, all the exhaustive provincial data they collected, and most importantly, the technically skilled talent they brought in and trained.
It all survived.
It all survived the collapse. That framework laid the vital, indispensable groundwork for the financial operations of the Republic of China that immediately followed the abdication.
It really shifts how you look at history. It is so easy to look at the history of the Chinese Empire in its final chaotic days as just this monolithic block of stagnation and darkness, just waiting to collapse under its own weight.
Right, the usual narrative.
But under the surface, it harbored this incredibly vigorous, desperate momentum. You had reformers like Zaize aggressively pushing the wheels of history forward, dragging the system into the modern age, even though their own empire wouldn't survive to see the final result.
They built the bridge that the next era walked across.
Which leaves us with a fascinating thought to ponder. We usually think of governments as the things that create institutions, a new government comes to power, and it sets up a new ministry of this or a new department of that.
Yeah, top down.
But when you look at times of deep, chaotic transition, is it actually the other way around? Do the institutions quietly lay the hidden groundwork that actually dictates what the next version of the state will be?
Oh, wow.
Think about the institutions functioning in our world today, right now. Which ones are quietly building the architecture for an era we can't even imagine yet? We started by asking how you save an empire on the brink of collapse. Maybe the answer isn't that you save the empire at all. Maybe the answer is that you build the machinery that allows whatever comes next to actually survive.
That is a powerful thought to leave on.
Something to mull over until next time. Catch you on the next deep dive. If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.